Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Happy holidays! And in the interest of today's episode, merri kurisumasu. About a year ago, a Patreon supporter suggested I could do an episode about Christmas in Japanese literature. I'd love to, I began to respond, but there just isn't that much to talk about. Well, except it's kind of important to the beginning and ending of All the Lovers in the Night, and it comes up in The Thorn Puller. Oh, and the climax of The Night is Short, Walk On Girl takes place at Christmas, and pretty soon I realized that the supporter was right and I had the makings of an interesting December episode. So today we're going to start out with the origins of Christmas, especially why Christmas is celebrated in Japan at all. We'll move on to how Christmas is celebrated in Japan, and we'll end with some examples of what part Christmas seems to play in Japanese literature, or at least the Japanese literature that gets translated into English. I'm going to make the assumption that virtually all of my listeners know what Christmas is, but just in case, Christmas is a Christian holiday, and it celebrates the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, called Jesus Christ by Christians, whom Christians believe is the Son of God. Jesus' mother, Mary, is supposed to have conceived Jesus without having sex. She's frequently referred to as the Virgin Mary. Jesus is the most important figure in the Christian religion, as well as several religions related to Christianity. He's also a figure who plays a role in several other global religions. In Christianity, Jesus was crucified by the Roman government in Jerusalem and then came back to life 3 days later. So Jesus is what was called incarnated. He's a God who became flesh and then crucified, killed on a cross, and then resurrected, came back to life. I'm only introducing those theological terms because we'll come back to them for one of the stories later in the episode. Christmas, most technically the celebration of Jesus' birthday, is most widely celebrated on December 25th. It's celebrated on December 25th by almost everyone who celebrates Christmas in Japan. But Christmas is not exclusively celebrated on December 25th. Some non-Western churches celebrate Christmas on January 6th, January 7th, or January 19th. I'm using the word Western here in a complicated church politics kind of a way, not an Eastern culture versus Western culture sort of way. For various reasons that are also outside of the context of our episode today, it's highly unlikely Jesus was actually born in the winter. 4th century Christians picked a date close to Rome's celebration of the winter solstice to celebrate Jesus' birthday. In fact, a lot of Christmas customs come from European solstice celebrations, especially Germanic ones, trees, evergreens, and the general emphasis on pretty lights at Christmas is universally shared with holidays warding off the darkness on the shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Before we move on, it might be worth mentioning that surveys show a small number of Japanese people apparently think Christmas is Santa Claus's birthday. To be fair, I'm willing to bet a small number of Americans think Christmas is Santa's birthday too. You might be wondering how the celebration of Christmas arrived in Japan. I'm planning to return to the topic of Christianity in Japan for an episode on Japanese Christian authors. It'll probably focus on Shusaku Endo and one of his novels like Silence or The Samurai, so I'll be brief here. To make a long and complex story as short as possible, Portuguese traders arrived in East Asia in the early 16th century. They arrived in Japan in 1543. Christian Catholic missionaries soon followed in 1549, so presumably 1549 was the first year Christmas was celebrated in Japan, even if the celebration was likely very, very small. After initial tolerance by Japan's powers that be, Christians were persecuted and martyred in Japan. They enjoyed a brief resurgence of favor before being permanently banned from the country for the rest of the Edo period. A number of kakura kurishitan, or hidden Christians, in Japan continued to practice the faith. They often developed practices that didn't look like the ways Christians practiced Christianity in Europe. Some of the kakura kurishitan chose not to reintegrate with European Christianity after the Meiji Restoration. Today, the practice of kakura kurishitan is thought to be extinct. I honestly don't know whether or not kakura kurishitan continued to practice Christmas. If they did, it would surely have been quietly and in secret. Christian missionaries from the rest of the world returned to Japan shortly after Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor in 1853. And then the 1858 Harris Treaty, one of the unequal treaties more or less forced on Japan, made it legal for foreigners to live in Japan. It was still technically illegal for those missionaries to evangelize, but the legal prohibition of Christianity died with the Tokugawa shogunate at the end of 1867. The early roots of the modern celebration of Christmas in Japan are a little foggy. The celebration of Christmas may have been promoted in Japan in 1904 as a way to help modernize Japan and to encourage more end-of-year shopping. I should note that the powers that be in the United States have also promoted specific celebrations of Christmas as a way to encourage people to shop. Franklin Roosevelt, for example, moved around the date of Thanksgiving to extend the period for shopping for Christmas. A 1906 newspaper records an appearance of Santa Claus. The artwork for this episode comes from a 1914 issue of a magazine for children published in Japan. And newspapers in 1926 discouraged the celebration of Christmas because Emperor Taisho died on December 25th. Immediately before World War II, America was not very popular in Japan. And immediately after World War II, there was a revitalization in the popularity of American culture in many circles of Japanese society. The celebration of Christmas, unsurprisingly, shrank on the eve of World War II and then expanded again after the war because Christmas was and has almost always been associated with American culture. Because Japan's Christmas customs are mostly adapted from American Christmas customs, folks from other parts of the world will have to accept that today's episode won't include discussions of Father Christmas or Boxing Day. Apologies. Christmas and Christmas Eve celebrations became more popular through the 1970s. We'll talk about a specific reason why in just a minute. And they became even more extravagant during Japan's bubble era in the 1980s, when many of Japan's current Christmas customs began to solidify. So there are two big takeaways here. One, culturally, Christianity has had some influence on modern Japanese culture. I didn't mention it, but for example, Christian schools played a significant role in Meiji and Taisho period education. But we shouldn't forget that Christianity has never been a major religion in Japan, and today a little more than 1% of Japan's population is Christian. A much higher percentage of Japanese people celebrate Christmas. Two, as a general rule, Christmas in Japan has very tenuous links to the Christian holiday. Of course, if you step back and look at the way Christmas is celebrated in most countries where Christianity is the largest religion, you'll notice that that's not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. Imagine you're in Japan in December of 20-something. What does the celebration of Christmas actually look like? Even though many Japanese people celebrate Christmas, it's not a national holiday. Christmas celebrations have to fit into a person's workaday life. The big winter holiday in Japan is New Year's, the Oshogatsu holiday. And the Oshogatsu holiday begins on January 1st and lasts 3 days. A quick side note that Japan has celebrated New Year's Day according to the Gregorian calendar instead of the Chinese lunar calendar, since it adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1873. It adopted the Gregorian calendar as part of the process of modernization. During the Meiji period, anything Western seemed more modern to the Meiji government. New Year's is the time schools shut down and businesses close. New Year's is the time the gods, or kami, visit. New Year's is the time Buddhists ring the temple bells 108 times to signify the 108 worldly desires. I've been told this sounds really impressive. New Year's is the time to visit friends and family. And New Year's is the more important time for gift giving, often in the form of an envelope of cash, an otoshidama, given to children. Christmas gift giving is a relatively new custom in Japan. Nevertheless, Japanese shoppers spend big on Christmas. They spend more than the equivalent of $1 billion on presents, toys, and cake to celebrate the holiday. The big exception about Christmas gift giving is that Christmas has become an occasion for couples to exchange presents. That's because in Japan, Christmas is a romantic holiday, sometimes called a night for lovebirds. This approach to Christmas as romantic holiday really took off in the 1980s. A lot like St. Valentine's Day, as celebrated in many parts of the English-speaking world, Christmas in Japan might be the time to ask your sweetheart out to a fancy candlelit restaurant. Sometimes it's hard for a single person to get a seat at a restaurant by themselves. Christmas might even be a day to elaborately propose marriage. One Japanese-based source I encountered went so far as to claim, if you don't have a date on Christmas Eve, you won't want to be seen in public. Ryu Murakami's In the Miso Soup, translated by Ralph McCarthy, about sums it up. Quote, "When I, the narrator protagonist, canceled our plan for Christmas dinner at a fancy hotel because I had to work, she, his girlfriend, was furious and said something to the effect that the only reason she had even bothered to have a boyfriend was so she could spend Christmas with him." In keeping with Christmas as a romantic holiday, Christmas is also a sexy holiday. Couples often rent rooms at love hotels during the Sei no Roku Jikan, or special 9 p.m. Christmas Eve to 3 a.m. Christmas Day hours. I should clarify that love hotels in Japan aren't necessarily seedy places for illicit assignations. They're not just places you rent if you're meeting up with a sex worker or you're cheating on your significant other. They're places to get away from roommates with your partners or to escape from family and small living spaces with your spouse. And Christmas is a great time to do it. Maybe I should have chosen a different turn of phrase. Japan does have Santa. Just in case you need a refresher course on Santa Claus, he's the man who comes down the chimney to deliver presents to children, especially American children. Some other countries have different gift-giving people in the realm of Santa, people like Father Christmas or Père Noël. Even though American Santa has long ago roots in connection with St. Nicholas, he is more or less a secular figure, most famously imagined by the poet Clement C. Moore, probably, in his 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, If that title doesn't sound familiar, you almost certainly know the opening lines, "'Twas the night before Christmas." Moore gave us Saint Nick as a figure with a belly that shakes when he laughs like a bowl full of jelly, as well as the famous names of his team of reindeer. The Coca-Cola Company also played a major role in the way that we imagine Santa. The images Haddon Sundblom created for the company's Christmas advertising in the 1930s solidified the idea Santa wears red and white. These colors nicely coordinate with the colors of the iconic soda brand. In Japan, some Japanese children write letters to Santa-san to thank him for last year's presents and list things they might like to receive. In 2020, the Japanese carrier ANA delivered more than 80,000 letters from Japanese children to Santa via a stop in Savoland, Norway. There's a long-standing urban legend that some Japanese people have so misunderstood Christmas that you can track down images of Santa hanging on a cross like a Christian crucifix. There is no proof that this has ever happened. The only photographs anyone ever produces are of a window installation by artist Yoshio Itagaki, and Itagaki's images are intentionally playing with this persistent rumor. Santa isn't limited to American Santa. Hotei is one of Japan's 7 lucky gods. His historical origins might be linked to a Chinese monk, Budai, who died in 916 CE. Rather than seeing you when you're sleeping, like Santa does in a famous Christmas song, Hotei is believed to have eyes in the back of his head. And purely by coincidence, he looks a lot like Santa Claus. Hotei is the iconic laughing Buddha you might see at a Chinese restaurant. He has a big round belly. He's frequently shown in art with a cadre of happy children, often carrying around a sack. It's unclear what's in Hotei's sack. It could be anything from clothes to the collected woes of the world. It seems that Hotei distributes good fortune rather than material gifts, and he does this especially for the poor, children, and the sick. There are 2 big food highlights of a Japanese Christmas celebration. One is Japan's famous kurisumasu keiki, Christmas cake. It is typically a light, spongy cake with a whipped cream filling and frosting, topped with ripe red strawberries. Ripe fruit is a luxury item in Japan, period. Fresh fruit is notoriously expensive in Japan. Strawberries are one of the earliest fruits to ripen each year, but December is too early for them to ripen outdoors, so strawberries for Christmas cake have to be grown in a greenhouse. The combination of fresh strawberries and whipped cream is also refreshing, tart, and not too sweet. Japanese people often have to pre-order their store-bought Christmas cake days or even weeks in advance. Actually, Christmas cake is such a popular kind of cake in Japan that it sometimes shows up at birthday parties during other parts of the year, too. Christmas cake, and food in general, is at the center of Christmas festivities in Asako Yozuki's Butter, translated by Polly Barton. Butter has been marketed in English as a novel of food and murder. That subtitle implies it's more of a crime novel than it actually is. Really, Butter is about a journalist named Rika Machida who is trying to figure out what makes an enigmatic, maybe murderer named Monoko Kaji tick. Kaji had a series of older lovers who died of mysterious causes, and she's loosely based on the case of Japan's real-life so-called konkatsu killer. Before her arrest, Kaji took lessons at an elite cooking school and kept a blog about her hyper-feminine lifestyle and the recipes she cooked. This was her final entry, posted at the end of November, 3 years before Butter begins, and the day before Kaji was apprehended. Not long now until Christmas. I adore this time of year when the outside world is at its most captivating. This year, I'm throwing caution to the wind and cooking a succulent turkey stuffed with chestnuts and rice, complete with a sumptuous honey-rich gravy, just as we learned in cooking class. They'll be taking orders for Christmas cakes in no time, too. I'm currently debating which to plump for. No, scrap that. I've decided. So right there, you see a couple of things. One, how Butter's Manako Kaji is really into food. Two, how Japan has its own takes on traditional holiday foods. Rice stuffing isn't typical in most places that have turkey. It would be fairly difficult for kaji to track down turkey in Japan, by the way. And three, at the end of November, kaji is already making final plans to order a Christmas cake. As events play out, the journalist protagonist Rika needs to complete certain tasks that Kaji assigns her to secure an interview with Kaji. One of these is a trip to taste Kaji's favorite Christmas cake. The year before last, I was planning on ordering a Christmas cake from West, Kaji tells her. Regrettably, I never got to eat it. Well-made buttercream is truly delicious, but unfortunately it's so hard to come by of late. Would you be so good as to eat the cake on my behalf? If you were to eat the real thing and tell me your impressions immediately afterward, we might have ourselves some fun. Rika actually has to call in some favors to get access to a West Christmas cake after the reservation period has passed. She compares West's cake to others, their surfaces crowded with strawberries, ivy, and edible sugar decorations. This is how she describes West's cake, and I've chosen to share so much of this section of Butter because I think it gives a really good impression about what these Christmas cakes are all about. West's cake has, quote, wreaths and candles rendered in cream on its white top, and then only 3 flame-shaped biscuits. Polly Barton's translation is very British, so these biscuits are cookies for my American listeners. 3 flame-shaped biscuits and a sprinkling of ground pistachios and walnuts. Its surface is as smooth as a snowscape. West's Christmas cake has even omitted the strawberries. Asako Yuzuki's food writing in Butter and Polly Barton's English language translation of it have already become a little bit legendary. Here's Yuzuki's description of Rika's bite of cake, which is also her first encounter with buttercream. No doubt because it had been refrigerated until very recently, the cream retained a certain firmness. As it melted under the heat of her tongue, the sweet butter expanded lusciously, rousing all the cells across her body capable of apprehending its rich goodness. The dense sponge, saturated with the rich, weighty aroma of milk, made her think that she would never again be satisfied by fluffy shortcake with its sweet and sour tang. True taste came with a high price tag and a high calorie count to match. You had to traverse mountains to come by it. Yes, all of the food writing in Butter is that erotic. I found the whole novel to be close enough to sapphic that I almost listed it with LGBTQ stories, but I wasn't quite sure that was Yuzuki's intent. More famous than Japanese Christmas cake is the modern Japanese appreciation for fried chicken on Christmas. Hosts and hostesses place orders with their local KFCs weeks or even months before opening their homes on Christmas. For those who don't think so far in advance or who want to eat at the store, the line is often hours long. The Japanese association between KFC and Christmas is the result of a brilliant marketing campaign from the early 1970s. The company, then known as Kentucky Fried Chicken instead of KFC, launched the Kurisumasu ni wa Kentucky, or Kentucky for Christmas, campaign in 1974. The campaign was the brainchild of Takeshi Okawara, the first KFC manager in Japan. He had a dream about a party bucket for sale on Christmas. Okawara's campaign heavily implied that fried chicken was the done thing on American Christmas. Those of you who live outside of the U.S. may not know, fried chicken is very much not a Christmas standard for most people living in the U.S. I'm from the very southern U.S. state of Georgia, one of the states most famous for its fried chicken, I should know. Most Japanese people weren't doing much to celebrate Christmas 50 years ago in 1974. So the Christmas in Kentucky tradition caught on and stuck. In 2024, KFC's Christmas Party Barrel includes 2 chicken tenders, 4 pieces of KFC's original recipe, 2 biscuits, and these biscuits appear to have holes in them straight through the middle, a special lasagna made with lobster. The Blue Sky friend who helped me track this down called it mutant lasagna, and a rich white tiramisu. A Japanese customer can order all of this on Christmas Eve for only 4,980 yen or 4,780 yen if they order by December 12th. That's about 33 American dollars, with a little more than $1 saved for placing an order early. Earlier incarnations of the Party Barrel have included bottles of wine or even champagne. I'm afraid I haven't encountered a KFC Christmas dinner in any Japanese literature, but maybe you have. I am almost certain that I've seen Kentucky for Christmas at least once in a Japanese manga. As I noted at the beginning of the episode, Christmas comes up a lot more in Japanese literature than I thought, at least before I started paying attention. And I've noticed that it tends to come up for one of 3 reasons. Sometimes Christmas is a setting in a story, and it emphasizes that something romantic is or isn't happening. Other times, Christmas is a symbol of westernization in the story. And occasionally, Christmas is just Christmas, a Christian religious story with a theological significance. We're going to take a brief look at several Japanese novels where Christmas plays a notable role, whether it sets the scene for romance, emphasizes that something is Western, or invites contemplation about a theological or theological-ish idea. Just a warning, I'm not going to outright spoil any of these books, but diving into the appearance of Christmas may involve takes on the plot that sticklers could possibly interpret as spoilers. If you're a long-term listener, you might know that I firmly believe there are very few stories that can truly be spoiled. None of the stories we're discussing today are among them. I will try to give warnings where you might want to skip small portions of the episode. Also, there are Read Japanese Literature episodes about a few of these books and/or authors. You can find out more on the episode page. Tomihiko Morimi's The Night is Short, Walk On Girl is one of my all-time favorite Japanese novels. It was published in Japan in 2006 and translated into English by Emily Balistrieri in 2019. You can learn a lot more about it in Read Japanese Literature Season 2 episode, Japanese Magical Realism. The Night is Short, Walk On Girl is a campus novel and a love story. I'm afraid I'm going to give away the ending, but this is a novel about a college boy pining for the love of his life, or at least the girl he thinks is the love of his life. I'm not really spoiling anything so much as giving you credit for being an intelligent reader. The narrative of The Night is Short takes place in 4 parts over the course of the hero and the heroine's academic year at the University of Kyoto. The hero and heroine take turns narrating the story. In Chapter 1, The Night is Short, Walk On Girl, the male college student hero tries to find his love interest, whom he refers to as the black-haired maiden, after they both attend a classmate's wedding. A series of bizarre events ends with her victory in a drinking contest against a notorious loan shark named Mr. Rihaku. In Chapter 2, Deep Sea Fish, the male lead looks for his love interest at a used book fair. In Chapter 3, Thus Spoke a Circumstantialist, the male lead pursues the black-haired maiden at the school festival. And Chapter 4, Cold of Evil, Cold of Passion, is the finale. It's also when the narrative turns to Christmas time. Everyone on campus, including the hero, gets a terrible winter cold that overruns Kyoto. The black-haired maiden is the only one who seems to be impervious to the cold, so it's up to her to save the day. On her mission to obtain an elusive cold medicine, the black-haired maiden notes how Christmas is clearly right around the corner in one of Kyoto's shopping districts. The whole area is festive with red and green decorations, and cheerful Christmas melodies are playing here and there. Her companion on this trip is a tengu. The translation glosses Tengu as a cocky, mischievous Japanese goblin with supernatural powers and an abnormally long nose. This figure from Japanese mythology reminds the black-haired maiden that Christmas is a foreign custom that has nothing to do with us. But, what's fun is good. This is where readers most sensitive about spoilers might want to skip ahead about 90 seconds. The climax of the story actually takes place not on Christmas Eve, but on the winter solstice, which falls somewhere between 1 and 3 days before Christmas Eve. Through a series of unlikely events completely in character for the novel, the hero wakes up from a fitful nap to find the heroine holding his hand. "I was swept away by sexual desire," he says. "I couldn't resist society's trends. My loneliness was unbearable. A myriad of thoughts passed through my mind, but soon all those transient things disappeared, and I was left only with the impression of her gleaming eyes, her voice like a whisper, and her beautiful cheeks. He has saved her, and she has brought cold medicine to save him." So it's during the Christmas season, and on the eve of Christmas Eve, that these two finally begin the romance that the hero has been pining for the entire academic year. In Japan, the academic year begins in April. Mieko Kawakami's All the Lovers in the Night also approaches Christmas Eve as a romantic holiday, but from a lonelier angle. All the Lovers in the Night debuted in Japan in 2011, and it was translated into English by Sam Bett and David Boyd in 2022. It isn't a happy novel. Like most of Kawakami's novels in English, it has a kind of bittersweet ending that suggests things might be looking up for the protagonist, Fuyuko Irie. Fuyuko was born on Christmas Eve. 9 years before the novel opens, she begins a new tradition. She could go out and get herself a cake. Because her birthday is Christmas Eve, the city is full of cakes. Instead, the only thing that comes to mind is a solitary walk. When I read All the Lovers in the Night for the first time in 2022, I didn't realize how much sadness lay behind a walk she takes near the beginning of the novel on Christmas Eve, a scene that has already played out 9 times. It's clear that Fuyuko doesn't even think of December 24th as Christmas Eve, even though it should be both a romantic holiday and a birthday. She always spends December 24th alone. You should skip ahead about 30 seconds if you're afraid of spoilers. The year-long plot of the novel provides some hope that this new year will be different, which makes events especially sad when they aren't, and she finds herself alone on the next Christmas Eve as well. So these are 2 books where Christmas is or is not romantic. There are also stories that include Christmas as a symbol of the West. One of these is Mina's Matchbox by Yoko Ogawa, published in Japan in 2006. It was translated into English just this year, 2024, by Stephen Snyder. Mina's Matchbox is a quiet, anecdotal novel that takes place in 1972. In 1972, Ogawa herself would have been 10. So this is a story that is set during Ogawa's own childhood. 12-year-old Tomoko moves in with her mother's sister and her mother's sister's family, while her own mother goes back to school to study dressmaking. Tomoko's uncle by marriage, the man married to her mother's sister, is half German, and his fully German mother lives with them too. Many things about Tomoko's new home are markedly luxurious, and there seems to be a very direct link between the fact that they are markedly luxurious and the fact they are sometimes markedly Western. One markedly Western feature of her new life is the elaborate Christmas dinner thrown by the German Grandma Rosa. Tomoko describes it as an extraordinary Christmas beyond anything she could imagine. First, packages begin to arrive at the door, all foreign to Tomoko. Strange colored powders, branches of plants she didn't recognize, cans with foreign labels, little bottles of liquid that might have come right out of a chemistry lab. Tomoko eventually learns that these are shallots, spearmint, sherry, powdered ginger, rosemary, all so exotic and yet somehow perfect for the occasion. Tomoko is also shocked when someone from the garden shop delivers a real live fir tree, or I guess a real, recently alive fir tree. "Christmas tree," she says. "I thought they were plastic toys." Tomoko realizes she's never even seen a fake plastic Christmas tree before. Remember, this is 1972. This is the very beginning of Japan's true embrace of Christmas, and Tomoko's family is celebrating the holiday in a very German sort of way. Of course, many of America's holiday traditions are extremely German, too. The entire scene highlights how Grandma Rosa is different from the rest of Tomoko's family. Foreign and, of course, less Japanese. Christmas plays more or less the same role in Mine Mizumura's An I Novel. I hadn't originally planned to talk about An I Novel, but Patreon supporter Kenji Lane pointed me in the novel's direction, and then I couldn't resist. The novel was originally published in 1995, which means it's one of two 20th century stories we're discussing today. The rest are 21st century stories. The first Christmas Mizumura describes in An I Novel probably took place in 1963. The Christmas Ogawa describes in Mina's Matchbox took place in 1972. An I Novel was translated into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter in 2021. An I Novel is a semi-autobiographical story about the teenage years the author spent in the U.S. after her parents moved the family to Long Island when she was 12. Even though Mizumura, both the author and the semi-autobiographical narrator, remain deeply ambivalent about her life in the U.S., the character is still living there, even 20 years later. As an adult, Mizumura reflects on their arrival in New York City at Christmas time, how moved she had been by the sound of Salvation Army volunteers ringing bells on street corners, by the smell of roasting chestnuts, by her first toy purchase at the iconic toy store FAO Schwartz. Mizumura's entire family was so impacted by that experience, they returned to Manhattan every Christmas as an annual family tradition. It turns out that Mizumura's parents had always been happier to celebrate Christmas than Japanese New Year. Mizumura, the narrator, speculates they probably thought Christmas was more Western and therefore a more modern and enlightened holiday. It's clear in An I Novel that adult Mizumura is uncomfortable with her parents' love of America and of the West. One final example of Christmas as a symbol of the West, I found Hiromi Ito's The Thorn Puller both moving and darkly hilarious. It's another semi-autobiographical novel translated by Jeffrey Engels. The protagonist and narrator, Hiromi Ito herself, sort of, is a Japanese immigrant who lives in California. In California, she's responsible for one teenaged daughter, one college-aged daughter, and a husband who is almost 3 decades her senior. But Ito is also responsible for her elderly Japanese parents who still live in Japan. So she lives this extremely trans-Pacific existence, spending months at a time in Japan and then returning home to California. In one humorous interlude, Ito and her teenaged daughter rush back to California after a trip to Japan on December 24th. They want to return in time to celebrate Christmas with the rest of the family. If Ito and her daughter leave Japan on December 24th, they'll still arrive in the U.S. on Christmas Eve. Ito, the narrator, offers one of my favorite lines in the entire novel, explaining the trouble they're going through here. "My husband is Jewish and I'm Buddhist, so it was crazy we gave a damn about Christmas at all. But hey, that's how our household works. Welcome to my world." Ito has to rush home to celebrate this American holiday in an American way because it's what her partially assimilated family expects. It's part of the life she has to live because she has split her life across 2 continents and 2 significantly different cultures. Finally, there are those stories that take up Christmas with its actual religious or theological significance, at least to play with it or reflect on it in an interesting way. One of these is Emi Yagi's Diary of a Void, published in Japan in 2020. It's the most recently published story we're discussing today. Lucy North and David Boyd translated it into English in 2022. The protagonist, Shibata, isn't Christian, and as far as I know, neither is the author, Yagi. But Mary, the mother of Jesus, turns out to be a really powerful symbol of motherhood across cultures, and that's the significance she holds for Shibata and in Yagi's narrative. 34-year-old Shibata works a professional job, but her male coworkers, her professional equals, unthinkingly load her with the mundane tasks they casually assume must be woman's work. Things like washing up after a meeting in the conference room, keeping paper filled in the copy machine, sorting mail that comes into the office. One day, Shibata has simply had enough. Instead of washing the coffee mugs left over from a meeting she didn't attend, she tells her section head she can't. She's pregnant. The smell of coffee triggers her morning sickness. Except Shibata isn't pregnant, and now she assumes she's stuck pretending to be pregnant for the next 9 months. An odd and perhaps implausible setup for a novel, yes, but a fascinating one. Shibata actually spends a lot of time reflecting on Mary's role as mother of Jesus. On the Christmas Eve that passes during her pretend pregnancy, she sees the image of that famous mother in a stained glass window and wants to commune with her. Shibata reflects for a while on the Christmas story and then turns to the person of Mary herself, to be eternally known as the Virgin Mother, as if that's the only thing that gave meaning to your existence. Hey, did you have any hobbies of your own? Or maybe there was a singer you were really into. You must have gotten stressed out sometimes. I mean, being called the Virgin Mother, even after your son was all grown up, and then to have him crucified like that. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. I just hope you managed to live your life the way you wanted, took naps when you felt like it, and had people call you by a name that made sense to you. Shibata starts thinking her life will be easier if people assume she's pregnant. It's not. In a non-Christmas conversation with Mary, she ultimately confides, having a baby isn't easy. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's been 2,000 years and it's the same old story, right? Diary of a Void is, among other things, both a reflection on and a critique of the Christian Christmas story, especially the way Christians talk about Mary's virginity. And it relates this fixation on Mary's role as mother, virgin mother, to the way Japanese society fixates on women's role as mother. Finally, I have to share an obscure but delightful Christmas story, the only story we're discussing today that's actually about Christmas. more or less. Merri kurisumasu by Masao Yamakawa. Merri kurisumasu has been translated by J.D. Wisco as Alien Christmas. Yamakawa originally wrote the story in the early 1960s, again, before Christmas really took off in Japan, and the story's publication in the early 1960s makes it the oldest story we're discussing today by a significant margin. There is very little information about Masao Yamakawa available in English. Yamakawa was born in 1930. He died in a traffic accident in 1964. I really wish I knew what his religious beliefs were. You'll see why in just a minute. Alien Christmas opens on an autumn night when the man discovers a tiny but beautiful woman laughing on his balcony. And by tiny, I mean she's only 5 centimeters. That's slightly less than 2 inches tall. Also, I would really like to do an episode someday on tiny people in Japanese literature. They just pop up in the most interesting places. At the end of the evening, the man makes the tiny woman a home in a drawer in his desk. Quickly, he realizes that his love for his wife of 3 years has become a burden, a kind of obligation. Spending time with a tiny woman becomes the man's only interest. Spoilers again, skip ahead 2 minutes if that bothers you. One evening, a few months later, the tiny woman thanks the man for all he has done to take care of her, but says she is leaving that very night. She's just been on vacation on Earth. Now she must go to another planet and be reborn as a life form there. There are still many intellectually delayed worlds out there, she tells him. I'm going to provide guidance to the hearts of life forms on another planet. I'll be a life form on that planet for a while before I die for all to see. In other words, I'll be a role model of how to live life. And on that planet, they will call me God. This may be beginning to ring some bells. The tiny woman is then joined by a man her own size who adds, "While we were here, we observed the changes in the hearts of the inhabitants of this planet, where one of our friends was supposed to have become a god long ago." Maybe ringing more bells. The tiny woman retorts, "It looks like a new god is needed. The people on this planet are always anxious. They must have forgotten how to love." So here we have a truly bizarre take on the incarnation and the crucifixion that involves tiny aliens, and a process that appears to be repeated on populated worlds throughout the universe. A twist remains in the story. There's a moment of reconciliation, and finally, the man recalls that these final events with the tiny woman and her male companion have all taken place on Christmas Eve. There are plenty of other examples of Christmas in Japanese literature. I do have a list with more than 24 stories available on the Read Japanese Literature website. It includes some titles that might surprise you, including multiple books by Ryu Murakami, who is famous for his gory thrillers. If you would like to contribute more ideas to Read Japanese Literature's list of Christmas in Japanese literature, I hope you'll let us know what titles we've missed through Blue Sky or Facebook or the contact page on the website. I've already had a translator chime in with an upcoming 2025 title that has Christmas scenes as well. I'm not sure there's a reason I can claim we should purposefully read Japanese stories that take up Christmas, although some of my favorite contemporary stories from Japan do incorporate scenes set at Christmas time. It is fun to pick up books that are seasonally relevant, and it is helpful to understand a little bit more about the way Japanese people celebrate Christmas and to appreciate why when these scenes show up in unexpected places. If you're looking to add a Japanese twist to your holiday celebrations, any of the books we talked about today are great reads. I've already mentioned a list of other stories with Christmas scenes up on the Read Japanese Literature website. There are currently about 25 stories there. I'd love ideas about other stories to add. And again, I'm really grateful for the help of Kenji Lane in building a list as long as it is. I also highly recommend the Japanese anime film, Tokyo Godfathers. It's a gorgeous movie playing with the Christian Christmas story and its symbolism. If you want to support Read Japanese Literature, keep in mind that North Americans can buy their books through our website. Everyone can leave a review on their podcast app of choice. And the best way to support Read Japanese Literature is by joining our Patreon for as little as $3 a month, or the equivalent in your local currency, by visiting patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Please don't join Read Japanese Literature or any new Patreons through the iPhone app. There's now a surcharge through the App Store, so organizations you want to support won't be getting most of your donation. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters, including new supporter Lorraine A. And merri kurisumasu! We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. As always, you can contact us through the website or Patreon, Blue Sky at readjapaneselit.bsky.social. We're now on Facebook. We're on YouTube /at Read Japanese Literature, Instagram, also at Read Japanese Lit. Thank you to Cy Catwell for fact-checking assistance. Any mistakes that remain are my own. You can find Cy Catwell at pixelatedlenses.carrd.co. A special thanks to translator Taylor Drew for help tracking down details about modern KFC Christmas dinners. Find her portfolio and blog at taylordrew.me. One more thanks to Kenji Lane for an incredible amount of help identifying other translated Japanese literature with Christmas scenes, as well as a thank you to other members of the Goodreads Japanese Literature group. And finally, as always, thank you to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.